Audible is my road trip companion.
It's kind of my quiet alone time.
Audible is a routine for me.
It's like a fun night school for adults.
I could easily be seduced into locking myself in a place where I do nothing but listen to books.
I never was interested in historical fiction before, but I'm obsessed with it now.
There are a lot of like classic and big titles that I feel like I've missed out. Since I don't have time to read, might as well listen.
If I want to catch up on the news or history or learn what's going on in the world, I can download a book and listen to it.
Because I listened to her story over and over again, I made the decision to go ahead and follow my own dream, which was to help other veterans.
I think there's like 180 books in my library now. It changes your perspective. It makes you a different person.
It's true. It's so true.
Download Audible and start listening today.
Hi, I am Tananarive Due. I'm an author, a screenwriter, and I teach Afrofuturism at UCLA. Thank you all for tuning in to the 25th Annual Festival of Books and our virtual event with Marlon James, author of the epic fantasy novel Black Leopard Red Wolf. Marlon is the winner of the LA Times inaugural Ray Bradbury Prize for science fiction. He's the author of 4 novels and the winner of the 2015 Man Booker Prize. Please remember to support your local independent bookstores during this festival. Copies of Marlon's book are available from our book-selling partner, Skylight Books. Marlon James, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. This is so cool.
I am so excited, and I've been so nervous about this interview. I don't know why, but I have so much admiration for you, and I wanted to congratulate you, first of all, on the Ray Bradbury Prize.
Thank you so much.
And that brings up a question about genre for me as a genre writer myself. I've noticed that some literary writers, even if they're writing outright science fiction, fantasy, and horror, don't like to be classified as writing genre. And traditionally, although I think it is changing somewhat, MFA programs didn't really know what to do with a lot of young new writers who wanted to pursue genre. So what are your thoughts on labels, and what did it mean to you to win this Ray Bradbury Prize?
My thoughts on labels is that labels can be an introduction into, for somebody who's unaware. And I think labels, can do some work in terms of trying to define what an author is. But I also think labels can be really restrictive. I think labels can also be really sort of a reason. Too often, particularly with literature, people use labels as a reason to not read, or a reason to exclude themselves from books. There are a number of times when I come across somebody who is up to the minute of buying a book, and I go, but I don't read crime fiction, or I don't read such and such, and in that sense, I find them useless, and I find sometimes they do more harm than good. It depends, I think, because when I head to the bookstore, I head to the detective section. It saves me having to go through a bunch of books to get to crime. My 2 favorite genres are still crime and fantasy, and it helps to get to those. But I think we still have this problem where, because something is a genre, we think it's lacking certain things. And it's interesting. I mention this, to literary fiction authors all the time. So, you may not think very highly of, say, chick lit, but chick lit is the only genre where women work. Because I don't know how they earn a living in literary fiction. It's like, I can't have Suburban Ennui at 2 p.m. I got to be at work. So it's, I rarely have questions about representation with the crime writers. Whereas I always have with literary fiction authors, because they always stumble over writing whoever is not them, usually whoever is not a white man. Mm-hmm. I don't have this problem with Richard Price. I don't have this problem with George Pelecanos, because, they do the work. So genres are great when we embrace them when we use them as a reason not to engage, we're the ones who lose.
I could not agree with you more on that. And speaking of labels, in recent years, we've seen a big uptick in the interest in what's called Afrofuturism or the Black speculative arts, really from authors like the late great Octavia E. Butler, of course, to Samuel R. Delany and N.K. Jemisin, to African futurist Nnedi Okorafor, also the music of Janelle Monáe, films like Daughters of the Dust. I remember back in the way back at my first Black speculative fiction conference, which was where I met Octavia Butler and my husband, Stephen Barnes, and Jewel Gomez and writers like that. You really could just fit all of us pretty much on a stage at that point. But now the Black writers of the speculative could fill not just an auditorium, but probably more than one auditorium. Yeah. And there's so much Blackness now in speculative fiction. And I've noticed a little bit of a synergy between the political and the artistic, especially for people who are very interested in Afrofuturism. What is it about the speculative arts that creates such a feeling, I think, of liberation?
Yeah, it's funny when the first time I ever sort of grappled with what Afrofuturism was telling me, I was actually listening to Funkadelic. Exactly. Funkadelic and Funkadelic and Parliament, but more so Funkadelic, in the sense that, and I'm not sure there's an equivalent in mainstream, which is my way of saying white fiction, where in order to understand where we are now, we kind of have to both jump back and jump forward. So, like a Funkadelic record is both blues and it's also sort of robotic synth pop. That's how you get an Atomic Dog. And I think with music as well, you go forward, but you jump back to the blues or the gospel or the spirituals. And I think the thing about Afrofuturism for me that really struck me and really, why these writers, Octavia Butler, whether it's music or film like Daughters of the Dust, or novels like Octavia Butler's, or Samuel Delany's, was that they realized that Black life is in a continuum. Whenever I talk about things like slavery and so on, my white friends are always surprised that I'm speaking in present tense. I was like, it's not necessarily that I'm living it, but it's that when you start to really get deep into sort of, let's call it Black art, that time is just a concept. And I think that's one of the reasons why I think so many of us are drawn more and more to write it, because we want to be beyond time and beyond space to write about the stories that we're writing about.
Absolutely. You famously said that you wanted to write a Game of Thrones set in Africa, and I'm sure everybody brings that up. And naturally, you meant that in terms of scope, of course, since Black Leopard Red Wolf is just the first in your Dark Star trilogy. Just as stories are a form of currency in this novel, how are they similarly powerful in our world? I mean, what to you is the significance of the big story, or in this case, several big stories in the planning, and why was it especially important for you to set it in Africa, a fantasy Africa?
Yeah, the big stories I can talk about first, because storytelling has always been the thing that has kept us alive. And one of the things that came over to the diaspora, and one of the things I experienced in my own family, was oral storytelling. My grandfather told stories, my mother told stories. I like to say my mother told lies, but she says she told stories. So there's always been that, and I've always been sort of felt that I've been sort of awash in stories and storytelling, and the whole idea of storytelling. Like it's not just when you hear a story, when you hear an Anansi story, you're not just hearing an Anansi story, you're hearing an Anansi story being told. So the telling of the story is as important as the story itself, because more often than not, that same storyteller can give you 5 versions of that same story. It also means that truth, becomes something that's different. In the West, we have this thing like the director's cut, the authentic version. Which one is a true story? If you go back to a lot of African folk tales, there's no such thing, as the true story. It's truth becomes something that you have to find and you have to decipher and you have to interpret, for yourself. I totally forgot the second part of that question.
Well, why was it especially important for you to set it in a fantasy Africa?
You know what? It started out because it didn't start out that way. It didn't start out as me trying to tell a story. It started out as me trying to find my mythologies. I gave the J.R.R. Tolkien lecture, I think a year ago, maybe 2 years ago, a little over a year ago. And one of the things I talked about was what it means to grow up where you take your mythology for granted. The example I gave was King Arthur. The average British person doesn't spend his whole day thinking about Camelot. But the very idea of Britain being civilized, the idea of Britain being a home of chivalry, the idea of Great Britain being this idea of court, comes from this mythology. Because the truth is, Britain was one of the most backward countries in Europe. The Vikings would have been appalled at how backward they were. So that mythology is important, even if they don't think about it. Now, imagine growing up without those myths, without that foundational mythology. Margaret Atwood said, human nature hasn't changed in 1,000 years, and by checking the myths. What if I didn't have them? So it really, the first thing was me just trying to get that bedrock story. Myths were truths once, and myths were religions in between that. And that's what happened. It was me searching for these stories that could tell me about myself. And in doing that, I just between that and my always trying to write a story, I stumbled upon a story that almost wrote itself. And and Africa, in a sense, and by Africa I mean pretty much the Sahel region and some of South Africa, because if I was going to write a story about Africa using all African myths, it would be a 1,000-page novel each. But in a sense that I realize, as a person who loves fantasy, even more so than sci-fi, that to love fantasy is to come to terms with erasure. Is to come to terms that I'm loving a genre that I'm rarely, if not ever, in. And if I'm in, it's never looking good. To come with idea that most of my ideas about fantasy is really just medieval Europe with a lot more witches. And so I had to let go of that. And I had to and that was hard. Because that's the entire lifeblood of my literary growth. But in letting go of that, I found some very surprising things. And we'll probably talk about this later, and I can talk about it in a different way. Black Leopard ended up being a very queer book. And the funny thing is, it's a research that led to that. I didn't set out like I'm gonna queer Africa. Well, Africa is already pretty queer, but it was a research. It was a research that led to it. It was realizing that there was always a way in which a lot of West African societies accepted queerness and differentness. I always said to my Black friends, "Have you ever noticed you've never had a problem calling people them?" People struggle with pronouns now, they and them. So you ever notice? I would say, you ever notice you don't have a problem with it? You just easily slip into it. Why do you think that is? So because you go back far enough in the histories and the mythologies, trans identities, transgender, different genders. There's certain tribes with 14 genders. That by going back to, this is funny. I didn't start writing this novel to look for validation. But in going back to these ancient stories, I found it. And I think that's why I knew it had to be an African story, reflective of the African mythologies and religions and philosophies that I was reading at the time. And I knew that I had to ditch the European, at least try to. I'm still writing in English. But I had to ditch that and change everything. That was the setting and not just the people and not just the creatures, but even the mentality and even the mindset, even the idea of magic and the idea of religion and the idea of you know heaven and hell, all of it. To sort of rethink, ditch, take on new stuff, and pretty much kind of have a certain sort of rebirth as a writer.
I love that you say it wrote itself, which is astounding to me, but also that level of discovery through the research to unlearn, because as a young writer, I started out writing Black characters, but then after I was exposed to canon, by the time I was in graduate school, I was writing white characters. So along those lines, if you could go back to childhood and pick one novel or story that would have rocked your world even more if it had had Black or queer representation, what would that be?
Ooh, wow.
I know that's a tough one.
It's
Because
a
we're
tough
so
one
used to
because
not being in the story.
I'm so used to not being in the stories. The
Right.
first novel I remember that made me want to really write was Little House in the Big Woods.
Oh,
Talk about a story where there is no Blackness whatsoever. But at the same time, we have this myth that Black people weren't in the prairie, and this myth that Black people aren't a part of the foundational societies of this country. It's one of the reasons why C-Pam Zhang's novel "How Much of These Hills Is Gold" is so important, because it restores the Asian presence in the Wild West. So I think yeah, growing up, funny enough, the first thing I remember being enthralled by wasn't fairies and magic; it was cowboys. And I think what's his name, Woody Strode, couldn't be in every movie, being
right.
the solid black type who John Wayne kills first. And I think I wanted that kind of to go back into those stories and restore us, because at the time I thought we just weren't there. I didn't know until later that we were just erased. So it would be that. It would be a serious restoration of those sort of, again, it's still mythologies, isn't it? I'm talking origin stories and old narratives. It's going back and putting back the myths.
Yes, and genre bending too, because you mentioned your love for crime fiction, which brings me to a question. As I was reading Black Leopard Red Wolf, I could see scenes as a graphic novel. And there's another reader, Tim Pratt, who pointed out to me that he thought he saw the hard-boiled noir in the novel. And I'm thinking maybe that did seep in there, where you're using that, what he called the morally gray detective main character navigating uncaring or actively hostile system. So is it a Rorschach where we're sort of seeing what we bring to it, or were you intentionally infusing, or maybe it just came through because of you love all genres, you love so many different kinds?
Yeah, I think it may be the latter, the last one, that it just comes through. Because I read so much crime fiction, I'm a big devotee of James Ellroy and Elmer Leonard, and ultimately my character is a detective. He's trying to solve a mystery. As for graphic novels, my original fantasy source was comics. And I'm still, in a lot of ways, more influenced by comics than anything else. I'm a total X-Men geek, to the point where I can distinguish issues by issue number. So it's and that kind of sort of that way of, particularly in the way of crafting action, comes from that. So yeah, both of those are still, they're so deeply ingrained, in me, that I don't even think I'm doing it deliberately, but I think those are the books that originally made me want to write books, and the books that I tend to be most excited by. Right now I'm reading, Tana French's new novel, and I'm a big devotee of Tana French. So it's always there. It's so present that I think it's almost sort of effortless now.
That's beautiful, the blending of all those, that lineage. One of my favorite aspects of Black Leopard Red Wolf is, and at times it's the most emotionally challenging part, is that the story revolves so much around the rescue of or search for children, especially one child. First havens are short-lived in this novel, and although Tracker is gruff throughout, and I love Tracker's voice, I'll get to that at another point. At times, his tenderness with children was very striking. So can you talk about the emphasis on children and how they fuel this novel and why?
Yeah, I think children, in a lot of ways, for Tracker, represents a chance to sort of redeem his own childhood. His childhood was very sort of emotionally distant and lacking love, and then he learned the reason why, and the sort of the deceit behind it. I think it brings it brings him to a life that initially he rejects. The novel near before the novel even gets off on its foot, the first thing he does is kind of ditches all these children he saves with another tribe, and he doesn't realize until way down in the novel that there's an incompleteness to him that these children help to complete. And I think there is that. But there's also, the idea of the children's adventure story, which I like, but also the idea of the outcast. Some of that is also again X-Men and mutants and so on. But some of it also is, growing up as a kid who was also kind of a nerd and kind of an outcast, I do have an empathy for those children and an empathy for kids who don't look how they're supposed to look and don't sound, how they're supposed to sound. But at the same time, seeing that it's not necessarily innocence so much as the potential to do right. And I think for Tracker, these children represent an opportunity to do right.
Beautiful. I love that. You mentioned that, of course, a lot is centered in mythologies from Southern Africa, and I know that the Sangomas are traditionally South African. How did that region emerge as sort of the leader in the research? When you have to, because you're right, there's a whole continent to choose from, and how did you land there?
I think some of that just happened in researching one thing led to researching another, like researching a lot about the Great Zimbabwe. Then you start to research around the region, and one thing leads to another. It becomes very organic, especially when you're not reading necessarily for a specific purpose. Like I'm not reading to cherry pick something. Like I need to read on witches today. Let's do that. Eventually, I started doing that, but initially, I was just sort of reading to get to know the world, and one passage leads to another passage, and one topic led to another topic, and there they were, and what happens is I end up with this sort of reservoir in my head, and never knowing when I'm going to use it, or never knowing when it's going to become relevant, but knowing that and sometimes it doesn't, and sometimes I don't use it at all, but having it there to draw from was very important to me. There's a lot of it that's also West African, and there's a lot of it that was stuff that I remember from not from researching any of the African regions, but just what we kept in the diaspora, what we kept in Jamaican folklore and Jamaican mythology and African American folklore. So there's that as well. But it's yeah, it was just a matter of staying open. One of the things I tried to do, at least, and I probably failed in some parts, because I think one of the problems sometimes when we try to write stories based on African myths and mythology is that we start to do this sort of cherry picking of different aspects of different cultures that sometimes have nothing to do with each other. And sometimes I don't think we realize we're doing it. Somebody's wearing the headdress of one people and the necklaces of another, and following the religion of yet another. And there's something to be said for mixing and matching. After all, we're speculating, we're building fictions. But I think it's also important to really know the tools that you're using. Otherwise, we're not doing anything, and we're not going much better than Tarzan. Yeah.
That's a good point, and I've heard Africans talk about sort of the folly of sort of a wandification, a Wakandification of Africa, because it can blunt our perceptions of what's really happening on the continent, because it's such a nutrient for us across the diaspora. But African Americans, of course, have this feeling of having been cut off from home. So yeah, there does tend to be a lot of that mixing and matching sometimes. My name is from Madagascar, right? So
Yeah.
I was named for a city in Africa that I have yet to visit. In terms of the novel and the character of Tracker, and I find Tracker to be a fascinating character, the extraordinarily gifted nose is this gift. This is something you don't see in the comics so much. Or actually, you can correct me if I'm wrong. There probably are superheroes who are known for having a nose. But what is the significance of the Tracker to you, and why is this particular gift, the smell, right? Why is that the perfect fit for the story you wanted to tell, or the stories, I should say?
It was a perfect fit. Funny enough, when Tracker was actually a far more minor character. Most of my novels are the product of trial and error. I try so many different versions, and usually usually the trick is, if I wake up the next morning and I want to write more, if I want to stay in this world, and I know I have a novel. But until then, there are all these sort of trials and errors and things that go nowhere. And in one of the failed versions of this novel, Tracker was just a minor character who was used in an even worse way, even a more base way than he is now. He was almost somebody who was, not even all that human, being used as a bloodhound by some other character. But that version of the novel didn't survive, thank God. But the nose survived. And instead of it being a kind of sort of exotic, freaky animal, which happens, and and there's a little too much of that in all these stories. What would happen if that character was a person who had to deal with the real life consequences of it? In fact, that's why at the beginning it nearly drives him mad. It's like, imagine if you can hear everything. It sounds like a great superpower when you're in a comic. But when you put a real life dimension to it, then it becomes a burden, it becomes a curse, it becomes something you have to manage, and then but it was also just fun,
right?
It was also just the idea that his most perceptive sense is smell. I wonder if part of this is because of what happened to me in 2015. In 2015, I got a commendation from the British Royal Society for the Blind for the audio version of my novel Brief History of Seven Killings. And one of the things they pointed out, which I never forgot, is they particularly appreciated how I didn't depend on sight to always tell something. Because if you're born blind, all that significance you're putting in a little black dress, they have no idea what that means. It's not, and the idea that, and it's something I do in my class as well. I'll give them a test. Write a paragraph where I know your grandmother is Republican using only sense of smell. And and that it pushes you in a way to see and experience the world in a way that you don't normally do. And I think that, for me, even more so for me than for Tracker, was a way to explore the world in a way that I don't normally do, because, like a lot of writers, we're very sight biased.
I love that. And that is something that learning writers often forget, is that sense of smell. So there is a lot of over-reliance on just a few senses. One aspect of this novel that I don't hear discussed that often is the use of humor, frankly. Yes, it's very violent. Yes, there are terrible, terrible things that happen in the novel. I don't want to minimize that, but Tracker's kind of smartass attitude throughout often emerges with a kind of bitter humor. Most often when he's with his frenemy, the leopard, and I love that first description of him smelling like an old man's ass. I just thought that was funny and also very evocative. So I was like, okay, I got that. So the prank when Tracker tells someone to rub the leopard's belly, which as a cat owner, I'm like, I don't know that that's going to go so well. And in fact, it did turn out to be a prank, and it did go too. So in the midst of so much violence and turmoil, there's this subtle thread, and sometimes not so subtle thread of humor. And I really just wanted to ask you how humor functioned for you as the author. Again, is
I think it's intentional in the sense that the humor might be there for me, firstly, mostly because I read about really dark stuff, and some violent things have happened in my books, and I don't shy away from it, and I don't blink with those things. But I think for my own sanity, the moments of humor and lightness end up in it. I also think, I remember writing, when I was writing my second novel, that even though the world may be the world may seem sort of dread steep for us, it's still the world for the people in the book, the world they're living in, and they have to find joy, and they have to find stuff to laugh at, and they have to find things that are funny, even if in an ironic way. And I find that, and it's funny. A lot of people, when I'm in interviews, are surprised that I'm funny because I write such dark stuff. But it's to me, it's almost it's a very it's how do I put this? It's essential to me that I'm trying to find a way of what I'm saying. That the humor is more than anything the way in which my characters reveal their humanity. Certainly for me. And I also, I like when characters, laugh with each other, laugh at each other. And most of my novels have a pretty, strong undercurrent of humor in it. Some of it I really some of it though is not deliberate. Some of the scenes that people find funny, I'm actually surprised. Well, yeah, so some of it isn't. Some of it is just, I think, when I'm writing, I do tend towards, whether it's sarcastic humor, light humor, or so on, that I think, without consciously thinking about it, that my writing pushes for a kind of balance. Because I need something to help you get through the dark parts, because the dark parts are pretty damn dark. And humor is a good way to get people through those scenes, I think.
I can absolutely see that. And that's a valuable lesson, especially now during this pandemic, where, joy is something that is elusive to a lot of people now, but we can't stop living our lives entirely because we've had to change that. And for me, it's humor and horror are kind of the 1-2 punch to get me through. Really quickly, I know this is a silly question. Speaking of humor, are you a cat person? I just thought I saw a cat person shining through. That's the question. That's it.
I'm really more of a dog person, actually.
Oh.
I grew up with cats and dogs, but I think you're really more of a dog person.
There was just something, obviously, with leopard.
Yeah. I think, I wonder if Black Leopard and Red Wolf was a European or a Eurocentric story, I think he would have been a wolf. I think the wolf would have been the shapeshifter. I think Leopard ended up being a shapeshifter because of what I was reading from a lot of these, again, mythologies. I think this one was Western, where a lot of the were creatures were cats. Over here, over here it's a werewolf. There would be a were lion. Or a were cheetah. And I think that's where a lot of that came from.
Okay, so that was a false signal there for me. Well, you also write realistic fiction, of course, and historical fiction. And I'm wondering what your biggest challenge was in moving to such an epic fantasy. Was it more of a relief to let go of sort of the constraints of actual events and make more stuff? Well, it's not really exactly making it up because there are existing mythologies you're working from.
Yeah.
But are there similar challenges in writing fantasy and historical fiction?
I think so. I think because for me, one of the reasons why I spent so long researching this, I remember when I got I have a photo of my first copy of Brief History when the publisher sent it to me. And the book is and I remember I just saw it recently. That picture of Brief History, that book rather, that copy is right above a book on African ceremonies. So I was researching this book before the previous novel even came out.
Okay.
So I was always kind of, where did I lost track of the question, funny enough, when I
Well, the
said that.
similar challenges in historical writing
Right.
and the fantasy
So
writing.
it's and where I was going with that was I needed to know as much about this imagined world as I would about 19th century Jamaica, or about 1980s Bronx, so that when I write a novel, regardless of whatever genre it is, it still feels like a historical fiction novel to me, and I think that's what I write. So even with Black Leopard Red Wolf, to me is how would a historical novel be written if you take that world as real? One of the
Mhm.
problems I have when people write about magic, for example, is they always write about magic from this Judeo-Christian perspective that it's not going to work, and they write about gods as if the gods aren't real. And it's the few things that annoy me more than when I see a story where the witch is there, the witch's spell is not going to work. I mean, what's the point writing a witch?
Yeah, bring it.
You might
Go
as well
big or
just write a Bible story and be done with it. So for me, I had to write a novel where I am already over the idea of a shape-shifting leopard. It's like, of course he's there. That I can't, because in the end, because if you don't do that, you end up writing speculative fiction like a tourist.
Mm,
And
right.
and sometimes I see that with my students where I'm like, this is not a story. This is a video game synopsis.
Ooh.
You're not there yet where you have to believe that world is as real as the one you're in. And I think for me, that's why they're similar. That's the process I think that's similar. Even though they're very, very different kinds of stories. I've written 4 novels and none of them, they're very different. But the thing they all have in common is I had to know enough so I can immerse. I call it being a journalist for imagined people.
Mm.
And I think that's what, yeah, that's what they have in common.
Yeah, so because whether it's history or fantasy, it's a world that is not, right? It's a world that either is no longer, if it was historical, and in
Mhm.
fantasy, it's a world that we cannot literally reach out and touch, and we cannot visit, we cannot be a tourist. So
Mhm.
that decision to create Leopard without the ta-da, no, here
Mhm.
he is. And he's
Yeah.
kind of a jerk, as far as Tracker's concerned or whatever. And it's just sort of
Mhm.
very matter of fact then.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great.
That yeah. I think that's also one of the reasons why so many of my novels are in first person. That it's I am very interested in voice, and I'm very interested that the person who's telling me the story is getting on with the story. Like if I'm reading a novel set in Brooklyn, yes, I want a full sense of Brooklyn, but I don't also want it to be a history book, or I don't want it to be a tourism brochure when we're trying to solve a detective case or something.
Right. You just
That was
land.
something I constantly remind myself, because where do you strike the balance? It's still fantasy. It's still a world that's totally new. You have world building to do, and you have to. The more information you give the reader is the more they can fully inhabit the world. That's the trick. You're writing characters who are already so inhabited in the world they don't have to spend time telling you about it. But if you do that, then the reader doesn't inhabit the world. So it's hitting
Right.
that balance between telling them exposition, telling them as much as we can about the world so they feel they're a part of it, without it feeling that the book is on pause because the characters are playing tour guide for you.
Fantastic. We'll have some questions from the audience soon, but I wanted to go back to something that you brought up earlier, was that in the course of your research, you discovered so much queerness in the histories and the mythologies, and a more matter-of-fact acceptance than certainly perhaps today, because it's still remarkable today, unfortunately, for us to say, oh yes, there's queer representation in this novel. And I wondered if you would elaborate on the importance of that. And even though it wasn't what you set out to do, it is also noteworthy
Yeah.
that this protagonist is queer.
Yeah, it is super important. It's super important in the sense that I think we've drank the Kool-Aid, and it's the mostly evangelical Kool-Aid
Mm.
about what Africa as a concept and Africa the countries in it are. You know, it's they're I have you know I have friends in Uganda and Kenya who think homosexuality is some little virus that came over from Europe, and that there are no such things as queer people and gay people. And honestly, I kind of believed it too. And so I wasn't looking, I certainly wouldn't have been looking for it to begin with. So to read about how the shoga men, and shoga is kind of pejorative now, but it wasn't in the past, and how a man who was known to be this way was, for example, the only person you trust to deliver your daughter as a bride, because everybody know that because you're gay, nothing's gonna happen. I have no reason to worry about you with my virgin children because everybody knows you're here for Mr. Man over there. Um, I remember Lola Shanye, the Nigerian novelist. Once somebody asked her if Africa will ever be ready to accept queerness and so on, and she said Africa was born ready until a bunch of TV preachers from America told them that they weren't. I was talking to when I interviewed Chimamanda Adichie. She mentioned everybody knows the two aunts down the street. Everybody knew the two uncles across the road, and everybody knew their purpose. It's not necessarily that you're going to invite them to dinner, but everybody knew that if those two uncles or those two aunts down the street were to leave the community will fall apart.
Mm.
So there is always a space. And if you jump over to African American culture, where people would say, "Oh yeah, that guy, he's sweet." They're not coming to knock down his door. They're not driving him from the neighborhood. Fine, they might not invite him to a party. Well, sometimes not. But this way in which Black culture has always opened up and made a space is also African. I didn't know that until I did the research. I didn't know that's where that comes from. It's why, even though your parents may have a problem with you being gay or queer, weird enough your grandmother is cool. It's part of it's such a part of us and a part of our DNA to welcome, to accept, to absorb all these differences. That when it's the homophobia that's Eurocentric. It's not the homosexuality or so on that we picked up from Europe. It's the hatred we picked up from Europe. That's where that came, that's what we have adopted. It's the hate we have learned, and it's the hate we have adopted.
That is so true, and there are probably viewers having their minds blown because that notion that queerness was imported by Europe to Africa is so pervasive. I know I've heard that said many times by homophobic people.
Mm-hmm. And it's not true. Absolutely not true.
No. So, all right. Well, more unlearning. The level of unlearning is massive that needs to be done. But thank goodness we have artists like yourself to help us navigate the new lessons and widen our worlds. So I'm just about maybe a minute early, if the engineers will forgive me. But we do have some pre-submitted questions from the audience members, and the first question is from Rhett, who says, your writing in Black Leopard Red Wolf is, though powerful and beautiful, is not easily accessible. This is his question. No, I'm kidding. How do you explain the wide acceptance you've received?
Well, it's not the first time I've written a not easily accessible book. Fun enough, I don't think so when I'm writing them. I'm thinking I'm writing these commercial blockbusters that that everybody's gonna get. I don't see it when I'm writing. I think I think I'm benefiting from a wider sense of what's possible in literature and certainly in the English language. And I've been writing long enough to know when the type of books I wrote didn't get published because it was very hard to find a publisher when I started out. In fact, I didn't really until a few years afterwards. Um, so yeah, I think that the reader I think has changed, and I think the type of the books that we find the type of stories that we're telling, has broadened as well. I'm trying to think if there is any other reason. I also think that let's call it difficult. And I'm not a big fan of calling books difficult. I think there's always a way in, even if it might take a while. But I like to think that whatever patience you're spending on the book is rewarded. And I think, like, if I'm investing in a novel, I'm saying I'm going to invest my time and understanding. Hopefully, I'm sort of rewarded in some way. And I think that the hopefully the reader feels rewarded by what they read, that the price of the ticket is worth it.
And I think readers have also learned that you're worth the effort, so that works in your favor as well. This is a question from Sam.
Mhm.
What techniques do you use in order to make a sympathetic character?
No, that's interesting because I don't know if I try to make characters sympathetic. Um, I think one thing I give my characters is my sense of stakes or my idea of stakes. I'm a big believer that characters should have stakes. What can I afford to lose, and what happens if I lose it or lose them? And I think that that's something that we can all sort of identify with. Characters, they love, they lose, they regret, they hope, they hate, they fall in love, they fall out of love, they reel from tragedies, and they try to move on. And I think if we believe that the characters, even if the characters don't go through that, I believe that they're capable of these things. I think that's it. I think that's all that that we need. I like the original meaning of sympathy, which means understanding between us. And I think for me, it's important that you reach an understanding of a character, so much even more so than say likability or sympathy. If you so a character that when you open up a character to be understood, I think that is what people may be thinking is sympathetic. It's and I think it's if you're I want to know. I am sympathetic to characters who I feel are capable of change, even if they don't. I'm sympathetic to characters who have to deal with dilemmas and deal with conflicts, because I'm deal with dilemmas and conflicts, and characters who have to find a way to make do with the world they find themselves in.
And I think even a prickly character like, like Tracker, definitely comes across as a character who has room to grow and care, even though he doesn't always do the things we want him to do.
Yeah. Well, I think there are always flashes that there's something deeper there.
Right.
And also, it's I laugh at origin narratives all the time. They annoy me so much, particularly in film. But in Tracker sense and in most characters' senses, that it's important to know what made your character the way they are, and maybe that will give us a reason to, if not like them, at least give them the benefit of the doubt, which we do in real life.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Well, the next question is from Kevin. How does contemporary African literature inform or inspire the Dark Star trilogy, if at all?
No, that's a good question because I read a lot of contemporary African literature, but I didn't necessarily read them for this.
Right.
I actually, again, it goes back to my original answer about this, where I wasn't reading to looking for a novel. I was reading looking for my legacy. I was reading looking for my mythology. So that, of course, meant reading past novels and old novels, not so much contemporary African fiction. So, Flora Nwapa, Amos Tutuola, I mean, my copy of My Life in the Bush of Ghosts is annotated. There's so many notes in it. Um, you know, Wole Soyinka translated Dio Faguna's Forest of a Thousand Demons, which I think was the first novel in Yoruba. And it's still worth reading. It's reading it into some of the foundations. It's not a fully successful book, but it's a very important book. Bessie Head. You know, I pretty much listen to anything Toni Morrison says, and eventually, I'm not just going to read Toni Morrison. I'm going to read what Toni Morrison read.
Exactly.
And when you mentioned Bessie Head, of course that meant I had to read, Where Rain Clouds Gather. One of my a big influence on me actually was not an African writer, but a Guadeloupean writer, Maurice Condé, whose novel Sigou was so important to me because up to that point, I have never read an epic historical fiction set in a totally African setting. Again, reading historical fiction, you run to the same problem that you have when you read a lot of fantasy novels. It means the bulk of the books you're going to read are European, or about European stories or Eurocentric stories. That's the problem of 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 fantasy and historical, which I read so much. So to come across Segou, it just absolutely blew my mind. Not just in setting in actual Segou and actual West Africa, but also keeping that the worldview and the frame of mind. It's so easy for us in the West to let that Christianness and that Calvinist come through. I always tell my students, you may not be a practicing Christian, but you're probably a practicing Calvinist. And to let go of that and tell a story, if you're going to write a story about ancient Segou, it must be the type of story somebody in ancient Segou would have heard.
Right.
It's just as though if I'm going to write a story about Vikings, it must be the kind of story Vikings heard, not the story, Christian readers of Enid Blyton heard. And that to me important. So to go back to circle back to the question and the answer, not a lot of contemporary literature because I was trying to find my own past. So it was a lot of that, and also a lot of writers who weren't necessarily considered writers, like Bamba Suso, who did one of the renditions of the Sundiata narrative. So I'm going back to the folk tales. I'm going back to the griots. I'm going back to the griots that somebody has thankfully translated, not always greatly. So I'm going back to those stories. I'm going back to all the musicians in particularly in Mali. So of course music becomes important and song becomes important. So it's not just the literature or the writers. It's anything that has that any way of anything that allows me to tap into that source of, say, the African epic, and that I read hundreds of.
Fantastic. Doing the work. That's what it is. Moira has the next question, which is, when are you going to do another Marlon and Jake Read Deadpool podcast?
We're working on it. COVID messed up everything because we tend to do them in studio right across from each other, so I can just throw pencils at Jake when he says something ridiculous. But we're trying to figure out. Well, we've figured it out. In fact, I have a whole bunch of mic and audio equipment here at my desk. So the short answer is soon. I think it's all dependent on as soon as I can, send these students off after teaching them 4 or 5 days a week.
Exactly. And our last question then is from Chad. Black Leopard Red Wolf has such a sprawling episodic feel. Did you consider making it multiple books? It would make an awesome limited episode series. Are you in talks to bring it to the screen? I know a little bit about this, but I can't wait to hear what you have to say about it.
Yeah. Well, you know what? It kind of is multiple books. It's a trilogy, but yeah. But I also wanted to write. One of the things I like about sci-fi and fantasy. My favorite sci-fi and fantasy novels tend to be the big ones. I like the idea of being so lost in a world. One of the things that has been getting me through COVID is going back to write these books, not necessarily because I just want to write, but because I want to be lost in a world that's not mine. And that's why the stories are so big and so expansive. In terms of film and so on, it was bought by Michael B. Jordan's company. I like to joke that Killmonger has the book. And we're proceeding, but these things, of course, they take time. And then there's Hollywood time, which is either really slow or extremely fast. So, and we're definitely in the latter. Of course, COVID has thrown a wrench in all of that. But we're moving ahead, and we're definitely committed to bringing this story to the screen.
Well, I joke, and I've been publishing since the mid 90s and have had things in and out of option. And I joke that you can grow a tree in the time it takes to move a Hollywood project forward. But I would say that now is the time for all Black art, but in particular the speculative. I've never seen anything like this interest. So I wish you all the luck with that.
Oh, thank you. And I think people, not just interest, but it seems people are waking up to the idea that people wanna see these stories. Everybody's so shocked that Lovecraft Country is a hit. I'm like, no, you shouldn't be.
No.
Dying to tell these stories, and people clearly have been dying to hear them and read them.
That's one of the most exciting things about our times is really how audiences, readers, viewers have really shown a willingness to embrace the new and the different and the fresh. And so your work fits in all of those categories. I have so enjoyed this conversation with you. We may have a couple minutes left. I don't know. I know it's supposed to be an hour-long event. I guess before I say goodbye, I was just really thrilled when we had our chat beforehand. You mentioned my novel, My Soul to Keep. I'm just excited you've heard of it. So, I mean,
the only one I've read.
It's been a while, right? It's been a while.
Because you were actually recommended to me. I was like, I want to read stories. I want to read stories that are speculative and are sci-fi and horror and so on. And I don't want that sort of European gaze to it and so on. And you had recommended, and I've read them. And again, it's the whole idea of there's something so sort of how do I put this? I feel like I'm being unerased when I read them.
Well, thank you.
It's I mean, not that I want to be in that story with that immortal.
No, nobody wants to be in one of my books.
Yeah, but I there's just like all I could think of is man, if I got to the story when I was 25. Damn, if I got to the story when I was 15. Damn, if I got into the story when I was 10.
Well, that's very sweet. I feel the same way about Octavia's work and your work. So congratulations to you, to the audience, those of you who are watching. Please support your local independent bookstore. You can order a copy of Black Leopard Red Wolf from Skylight Books. Thank you so much to the audience, to all of you watching. Thank you, Marlon James, for this amazing conversation, which would have been great if we were just sitting having coffee somewhere. But the fact that it's in public is fine too. And you have a great night.
You too. Thank you so much.
All right. Bye-bye.